compromise the Second Amendment in the aftermath of these shootings, which is why these stories, see them, you know, almost every week, but you will never see them covered on the big news networks, because they just don't want people to know that a gun is a neutral object, believe it or not, and it can be used for good or bad. And in many cases, it's used for good and to stop potential massacres. That's what they don't want you to know. 5 ways you don't realize movies are controlling your brain. This is out of cracked.com. This isn't some paranoid conspiracy theory. It's a fundamental part of how human culture came about. Ask yourself, why do we go and watch superhero movies? After all, variations of these stories about brave superhuman heroes predate recorded history. We used to tell them around campfires before written language even existed. They were created as a way to teach you how to behave. And basically it talks about, you know, thousands of years ago, before parchment, before written record, these campfire stories were told in order to encourage the other members of the tribe to go and fight the other tribe. From the article, they were taught, you know, why we hate the tribe across the river, why our tribe is better than that tribe, why it's important to go off and fight in the next war, no matter how scared you are. So this article illustrates how basically archetypes and role models, which have been used throughout human history for good, for the protection of a tribe to fight the next tribe over, have basically been hijacked by the movie industry and by the entertainment industry in general to brainwash the public. And it's a point I've made over and over again, which is, why do you think the public is engaging in increasingly, you know, aberrant and bizarre behavior? Why do we see more and more mass shootings? Why are kids acting like, you know, the droogs out of Clockwork Orange? Well, it's because in entertainment, movies, media in general, our positive role models have been taken away. They've been eviscerated, deliberately so. And on top of that, it's now common knowledge that to borrow all that military equipment to make an action movie like, you know, Transformers or something with lots of explosions, lots of military vehicles in it, you don't only need the consent of the Pentagon, the military industrial complex, to make that movie. You need to give them a role in actually writing the script. This is all admitted now. It's not a conspiracy theory. So that's why you see every major action movie is pro-US military, it's pro-intervention, pro-invasion, pro-war. So this article basically exemplifies how not only do they take the archetypes and role models and make them pro-war, basically everything about the movie is intended to hark back to that ancient tribalism and gear people up to accept, to support the next war, whatever war that may be. And they give another example of how these movies are not only used to brainwash people to change their thought patterns, but their actual behavior. Consider this. After Jaws hit theaters, we nearly drove sharks to extinction with feverish hunting, to the point that their populations may never recover. Every single person who saw that movie knew that it was fiction, knew the characters were just actors, but in real life, they knew there isn't a shark big enough to eat your boat. When the genius science character in the movie agreed that killing the shark was the only way to prevent dead tourists, we assumed that part was true. So we killed all the sharks based on what the make-believe movie told us. So they're basically making the point that, and there's other examples in there, these movies not only shape patterns of thought, they not only brainwash people into supporting modern-day tribalism, the hijacked version of it, which of course is war, but they also actually directly alter and shape people's behavior. So I urge you to read that. 5 ways you don't realize movies are controlling your brain at crack.com. Very interesting article. Now, Kurt Haskell, this is Kurt Nimmo out of INFOWARS.com. Kurt Haskell wins House of Representatives primary in Michigan. Michigan attorney Kurt Haskell has beaten his opponent in the August 7th primary for a seat in the House of Representatives. Haskell defeated fellow Democrat Ruben Marquez and will-faced Republican Tim Walberg in November. Walberg is the current representative for Michigan's 7th congressional district. And of course, as you know from his many appearances on the Alex Jones Show and INFOWARS Nightly News, Kurt Haskell was the eyewitness who blew the lid off the staged underwear bomber case, where of course he tried to or he was set up as a patsy to smuggle the underwear bomb on the plane. Haskell saw him being helped on the plane, despite the fact he had no passport, by a well-dressed man. And of course, all the other inconsistencies with that story that we've exposed at length. So basically, just a bit of good news. I mean, this is a guy he's had his battles with the system. They've tried to silence him at every turn, but he's got back onto the field, and now he's starting to kick some butt. He's beaten his Democratic opponent in the primary, and now he's going on to have a shot at becoming a congressman if he defeats this Republican. So basically, all of us here at INFOWARS.com wish Kurt Haskell the best of luck in defeating his opponent, because, of course, he will become, hopefully, one of the precious few moral and upstanding members of Congress. So exciting and positive news there with Kurt Haskell potentially becoming a congressman. Now we're going to throw to David Knight, who's going to talk about free speech zones and how they're increasing the use of them, as well as an interesting story about how the GSA was told by the Obama administration in the early days of the Occupy Wall Street movement not to interfere with the Occupy protesters. So here we go to David Knight.
Thank you, Paul. This is David Knight reporting for InfoWars. George Washington once said, "The British walked about freely, but between high walls." Well, that's quite literally true today in America. Today, at political events, free speech is restricted to political zones, free speech zones, sometimes to caged areas. This is what free speech looks like in 2004 at the Republican National Convention. And in a case that goes back to that convention, an appeals court today has upheld corralling free speech into zones. A federal appeals court has upheld the creation of no demonstration zones which prohibit free speech in certain public areas. The Second Court of Appeals ruled yesterday upholding a lower court's decision that declared such zones as being permissible. A federal appeals court has upheld the creation of no demonstration zones which prohibit free speech in certain public areas. The Second Court of Appeals ruled yesterday upholding a lower court's decision that declared such zones as being permissible. Back in 2004, two pro-life demonstrators were protesting at the Republican National Convention. They were protesting the fact that there were too many pro-abortion speakers, people such as Giuliani, Schwarzenegger. They were told that they could not stand on a public sidewalk holding a sign, and they had to go to a remotely located free speech zone. Well, the so-called free speech zone had, as I put it, individuals of varying and opposite opinions forced to stand together in one consolidated caged area, which included a stage with a microphone. Well, as unconstitutional as this was, they didn't refuse to go. But as they were walking, they questioned the officers and recorded the questions. And for doing this, they were arrested for not relocating fast enough. They said they took us to an abandoned warehouse where they funneled hundreds of people into cages that they'd set up for this purpose. They treated us like cattle. Well, they treated them like cattle because they think of them as cattle. They don't think of them as American citizens with recognized rights. At no time did these defendants have their case heard by a jury. Their lawsuit was thrown out by a single judge, and the appeal was heard by a three-judge panel who sided with the government. No surprise there. The New York Civil Liberties Union has another case relating to the same events, but not to these particular abortion protesters. And Christopher Dunn says that that case should not be affected by this recent ruling for the two abortion protesters. This decision involving two anti-abortion protesters has no bearing on the major convention litigation now pending in federal district court, said Christopher Dunn, Associate Legal Director for the New York Civil Liberties Union. In that litigation, the New York Civil Liberties Union is challenging mass arrests, detentions at Pier 57, and the blanket fingerprinting of protesters. Get that, blanket fingerprinting of protesters. The appeals case decided yesterday has nothing to do with any of these issues. Well, things are going to get more dangerous for citizens who want to exercise their free speech at this year's convention, because earlier this year, Congress passed the Federal Restricted Buildings and Grounds Improvement Act. Well, what exactly does that improve? Well, it just improves the chances that our leaders can now do whatever they wish without anyone complaining about it. Because if you protest an event where the Secret Service is guarding someone, it is now a federal crime. This new law permits Secret Service agents to designate any place they wish as a place where free speech, association, petition of the government are prohibited. It permits the Secret Service to make these determinations based on the content of the speech. That's right. If they don't like what you're saying, They can deny you the right to say it. Cheering crowds are fine, but if the Secret Service arbitrarily doesn't like what you're doing, it's a federal crime. And as we saw yesterday, the Obama White House has already told GSA to step down on Occupy protesters. So if the government finds what you're saying is useful to their agenda, they tell enforcement to step down. But if they don't like what you're saying, they use the full force of unconstitutional laws against you. So our quote for the day is the First Amendment itself. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. I get that again. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the right of the people to peaceably assemble. This is David Knight reporting for INFOWARS Nightly News. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks, David. Now we're going to go to a clip, video we put together earlier today. We really want this to go viral. It's entitled Full Spectrum Evil, Secrets of Global Domination. And in this video, Alex Jones uses the games of chess, Monopoly, and Risk to illustrate and explain the classic modes of control used by our rulers and how they use these different techniques to enslave us. So let's go to the clip.
Alex Jones here to cover a topic, an issue that is one of the most important I've ever discussed. This information is very closely held by governments and elite corporations. They do not want you understanding this. Now, many of you that are already aware of this, it'll seem simple, but large swaths of the global population have no idea the real geopolitical paradigm that we're living in today. Today, we will look at the real forces, the real players in the battle for 21st century global hegemony. I'm going to break down who really rules the world, how they control the planet, and how they are trying to usher in a world war that is really pointed at the general population. To begin my illustration, I have 3 different board games here. Chess, the classic game of Risk, as well as Monopoly. And we're going to look at these systems of stylized warfare. And between these 3 systems, we find the truth of the system that we're living under. How do we know that system? Well, books written by people like Carol Quigley at Georgetown, Bill Clinton's mentor. They think we're stupid, and so we have their own documents. To begin with, I'm going to use a Lego chess set as an illustration to break down primitive forms of government, warfare, and domination. If you look at this set, you notice there are 2 sides. There is the red and there is the green, or there is the black, there is the white. From the beginnings of civilization more than 6,000 years ago until about 1700, this was the model of warfare between nations. There were occasional alliances, but by and large, warfare and politics was carried out in a very 2-dimensional way, like a chess set. You have the ruling class, the royalty, the priest class, the military elite, the generals, and in front of them you have basically their conscripts, or the lower class fighters, who can also represent just the general population. And these 2 groups are engaged in warfare and base domination against each other to control larger areas of land and the vassal populations living in serfdom upon it. One area that we see from the ancient chess model that is still used in statecraft by the globalist is the fact that sometimes wars were launched, in the case of the French and the British, against each other when they had rebellions at home. They soon learned it was a way to turn inner anger at the state against a foreign state and to reduce the population of young males that you didn't have jobs for. The 2-sided fight is a bygone era. In truth, for more than 300 years, the globalists have been financing multiple sides of wars, knowing that conflict destroys nations and gets countries deep into debt. And that is the key. They're financing both sides. And we see this being pioneered by people like the